Welcome to the mother relay. We're covering today's top boxing news.
Okay, we'll start with this. Two-division champion Hannah Gabriels had this to say ahead of her Clarissa Shields rematch, their showdown in June. What Shields has done is great, but it doesn't determine what I am going to do. It's very hard to imagine that the second fight will go any differently than the first one did.
It's going to be featured on DAZN.
What she has done is great, but it doesn't determine or define what I'm going to do. Gabriels vowed during a press conference held in Detroit to formally announce their rematch. When I first fought her, I came to Detroit knowing if I didn't knock her down, I wouldn't win. I came to Detroit knowing that I didn't have the experience that she has. I came to Detroit thinking she was stronger than me. I came to Detroit thinking I wasn't as strong. All of those things were wrong. Strength in boxing doesn't matter, and I'm about to show you that.
Hannah Gabriels hasn't had a fight in roughly 2 years. The last time she was in action was in April of 2021.
2 years ago. 2 years later, she's 40 years old. She's got ring rust she needs to shake off. And it's very hard to imagine that the second fight is going to go any differently than the first one did.
Hannah Gabriels may have scored a knockdown in their first meeting, their initial meeting, but that fight between her and Clarissa wasn't as competitive as the Marshall fight.
In the last 2 years, I discovered things I didn't know. I have focused on those things that matter, insisted Gabriels. She has experience that I didn't have in my amateur career. That used to make me make a lot of experience. It makes me focus. My boxing is much better now. I want to measure it up with the best and see what the outcome is going to be. That Hannah hasn't fought in 2 years.
How do you gauge improvement?
How do we know that Hannah Gabriels is a better boxer here today than when last we saw her, when we haven't seen her since then?
I don't like her chances.
Just being honest, for Clarissa Shields, this feels like a tick-over fight, a keep-busy fight, against a good fighter, a very good fighter, a multi-weight champion, current reigning, at least at light heavyweight.
So I'd be lying to you if I said I didn't find this rematch peculiar. A part of me still feels that even though Clarissa Shields beat Savannah Marshall, even though she won,
Clarissa wasn't in any hurry to run it back.
even though the people at Boxer would have been happy to pay for it,
Consider that Clarissa Shields demanded that the second fight take place on American soil without any American backing to pay for the show. That Shields versus Marshall in America would not have made what it made in the United Kingdom, and yet Shields was insistent that if there's going to be a second fight, it has to happen in America.
who's going to pay for it?
The other day, by way of the Flint Journal, it was announced that Clarissa would be giving away 1,000 tickets to her June 3rd championship fight in Detroit. 1,000.
That's a lot of comps.
Depending on who you ask, some might say that Clarissa Shields quote-unquote dog-walked Savannah Marshall, that it was a clinic. I don't think these people are being completely honest. I think that was the hardest fight of Clarissa Shields' pro career, and I feel like Savannah Marshall took something out of Clarissa.
Some people might get offended hearing that, but what's to be offended about?
I've seen every single one of Clarissa Shields' professional bouts, and I've never seen her have to work that hard against as big a puncher as a Savannah Marshall, who was getting in with shots, and I think those shots, I think she took something out of Clarissa, which is why Clarissa wasn't in any hurry to run it back. You say that
She was.
She just wanted it in America.
But she was willing to go back to the UK for Natasha Jonas.
Just not for Savannah.
What's the difference between fighting Natasha Jonas and fighting Savannah?
Natasha Jonas is a older, smaller fighter. It's a much easier fight for Clarissa than the Marshall fight would be, the Marshall rematch.
What do you imagine that Clarissa's making for this Hannah Gabriels fight? I don't think she's making with Hannah Gabriels in their second fight what she would make in a second fight with Savannah.
Relevance of this conversation is getting an idea
What's next?
what's going to happen beyond her upcoming fight, beyond the Gabriels rematch, and for Savannah, beyond the French on Cruz fight.
Well, Savannah may have to fight unbeaten up-and-comer Jadeja Green, but Clarissa...
What's Clarissa going to do? There's not a lot of big fights, decent-sized fights at or around these weights. The talent pool anywhere in between 154 and 168, it's not that deep.
Because there ain't that many girls up there.
It's safe to say that a Savannah Marshall rematch pays Clarissa better than most, if not all, of the other fights she can have at her around these weights, and yet...
I just feel like she made things hard to do the rematch.
And it might have been deliberate. She was willing to go to the UK for a Natasha Jonas fight, but not for a Savannah Marshall rematch.
She doesn't have to run it back with Savannah. She doesn't.
But she's willing to run it back with Hannah Gabriels. Do you see what I mean?
Clarissa doesn't have to fight Savannah Marshall for a second time.
She doesn't owe her a second fight. Then again, she doesn't have to fight Hannah for a second time. She doesn't owe her a second fight, but she's giving her one.
Now do you understand why I have questions?
Now, I don't know if Clarissa and Savannah are ever going to run it back. In truth, Savannah's got a good-sized fight in front of her already in Franchon Cruz.
So if she beats Franchon, what then?
She'll have to fight her mandatory challenger by way of the WBC, Jadeja Green, if she ends up beating Franchon.
The two decent-sized fights.
I don't know that we're ever going to get a Shields versus Marshall rematch. If we are at some point, doesn't look like it's going to be anytime soon. Men's welterweight news. Former unified champion Keith Thurman on Terrence Crawford says, you want full acknowledgement, you need to take out a Thurman or a Spence.
It's already been a year, over a year, since Keith Thurman's last fight.
Currently, Terrence Crawford is supposed to be in talks to do that long-awaited, long-anticipated Errol Spence Jr. fight. And if that happens, where does that leave Keith Thurman?
Good question.
Thurman believes that Crawford's lofty stature amongst boxing's elite could benefit greatly from facing him, of course. Behind the scenes, the Omaha, Nebraska native is hoping that contract negotiations with Spence will eventually be finalized, leading to an undisputed clash in the second half of the year. No matter which route the pound-for-pound star chooses to go down, Thurman is adamant that if Crawford wants the respect he truly deserves,
only two fighters should be firmly on his radar.
Yeah, you beat Sean, said Thurman to ES News recently, but you want to be fully acknowledged, you need to take out a Keith Thurman. You need to take out an Errol Spence Jr.
I don't know how much acknowledgement, I don't know how much credit Terrence Crawford's critics would give him for beating today's Keith Thurman when they barely give him any credit for knocking out Sean Porter. And I said he was going to knock out Sean Porter.
Immediately after the Sean Porter versus Errol Spence Jr. fight, based on the aesthetic of that fight, that it was difficult for Spence, that it was more arduous than anticipated, and that he wasn't able to get the knockout, you saw a push for Sean Porter to get a Crawford fight on the premise that he could give Crawford all the same problems that he gave Errol Spence Jr., and he didn't.
I saw people saying that Sean would be too aggressive, too strong, too busy a puncher for Terrence Crawford, that Terrence wouldn't be able to hold him back.
2019, before they actually fought, I stated I think Sean would get stopped. I think that Terrence Crawford would go on to be the first and only fighter to stop Sean Porter. That aggression of his, it would backfire with Terrence, who can play the sharpshooter whilst fighting on the fly, whilst on the move. The prediction stuck.
But that didn't dissuade Terrence Crawford's boo-birds from downplaying the victory, from downplaying the knockout, with all manner of mental gymnastics.
You think about today's Keith Thurman, a fighter who hasn't fought in over a year.
He says for Terrence to get acknowledgement, he's either got to fight him or Errol Spence Jr. He's in the process of trying to fight Errol.
You know, if this is a fight that Keith Thurman truly wants, or if he has his eyes on the winner of this fight, one would think that he'd stay sharp, stay busy, fight someone.
Why isn't this guy fighting?
It could be any number of things. It could be that Keith Thurman doesn't want to fight unless it's in a high-profile fight because he wants to get paid a certain way.
Could be that.
It could be that Keith Thurman knows he's just a shell of his former self and he has to tread carefully. That every time he gets out there, he risks another loss. And rather than risking that, he won't risk anything at all. Not unless it's a high-profile fight.
Could be that.
Could be a combination of things. It could be that the Showtime platform does not have enough resources to accommodate all of their fighters, Keith Thurman included. They just ain't got it in the budget to do a fight for this guy. And if they do a fight for this guy, it's not going to be a big fight.
If it's not going to be a big fight, then he don't want to do it.
Combination of things. The whole point of fighting Mario Barrios off a knockout loss to Gervonta Davis was to allow Keith Thurman to shake off the cobwebs and get back into action.
He's done that.
Over a year later, we're right back where we started because Keith Thurman has once again allowed ring rust and dust to settle, to collect, and he's going to need a tune-up or something.
Yeah.
If they make that Spence versus Crawford fight, if they do, on the undercard, ideally, perhaps as the co-main event, you could get a Thurman versus Ugas fight, a battle of the former WBA champions, both of which haven't fought in the last 12 months.
That makes sense.
It's hardly a good thing that it's taking this long for either fighter to return to the ring. They should have had a tune-up fight by now.
They could have.
Keith Thurman is rumored to be a contingency plan, a plan B for Errol Spence Jr. should things not work out with Terrence. They'll move forward with the Thurman fight. That's what most people seem to think.
Though sitting around waiting for Errol doesn't exactly improve his chances.
We are 5 going on 6 months into the year of 2023. And based on that, Keith Thurman could have squeezed in a fight in February or March to prepare him for a Spence fight or the winner of Spence versus Crawford. He hasn't done that. You say that, well, it's because the WBC ordered him to fight Errol.
That's why he hasn't fought.
Well, okay. Did he fight Errol?
No.
Is he about to?
Doesn't look like it.
Time squandered. That is the legacy of Keith Thurman, the former unified champion.
Pissing the time away.
Men's middleweight news. Jermall Charlo says he's willing to bypass tune-ups and march straight into a Demetrius Andrade showdown. One might argue that an Andrade showdown has a little bit more profile, more prestige than a Carlos Adames fight. Carlos Adames, Jermall Charlo's mandatory challenger by way of the WBC, who thinks Jermall is a coward.
Been waiting to get a shot at Jermall Charlo for a while now. He went down to Cancun late last year at the WBC's annual convention.
He did.
Petitioned for them to order the fight.
That request was rejected. It was denied, so that 5 months well into the following year, Jermall Charlo could still sit here without a fight date, without a fight lined up, talking about skipping tune-ups and bypassing this and that so he can fight Andrade. But what about Carlos?
He's a PBC fighter, the same as Jermall.
Jermall, who seems more focused on Andrade at this point in the juncture. Andrade continues to acclimate to life in a new weight class. He's still optimistic that a clash between himself and Charlo could come into fruition. In fact, instead of taking his normal approach of simply crossing his fingers and praying, Andrade picked up his cell phone and took legitimate action. He called me the other day, said Charlo of Andrade to a group of reporters recently. We talked for like an hour, just trying to get this shit done, with the two attempting to hammer out a deal behind the scenes. It's unknown what Charlo's immediate plans are. In just over a month, it will be 2 years since the hard-hitting star has defended his WBC middleweight title.
This was a fight that the people at Matchroom and DAZN tried to bankroll years ago. Years later, it still hasn't happened.
I remember they were willing to give Jermall Charlo something like $6 or $7 million to come over to their side of things and do the fight, back when both he and Demetrius Andrade were middleweight champions. And while Jermall is still a champion, Demetrius isn't.
He's a super middleweight now.
He's at super middle, and Jermall is still at middle. Jermall, who explained his meager schedule, and the explanation was a bit unclear. He did reveal that he dealt with a nagging back injury, coupled with a number of personal issues as well. With the 32-year-old anxious to return, he admitted that he has a bit of unfinished business to attend to in the middleweight division.
What's that?
Demetrius Andrade is at super middleweight. If a showdown against Andrade can be finalized, Charlo appears more fixated on going down that route. In the event that negotiations continue to go smoothly, Charlo would seemingly need at least one return fight in order to scrape the rust off his overall game. The notion of a warm-up bout, nevertheless, is something that Charlo wholeheartedly disagrees with.
Now he wants to fight Andrade.
Did waiting this amount of time to potentially do this fight, did it benefit the fight in any way? Is the fight somehow bigger now than it was years ago? It seems to me that only really hardcore boxing fans that follow the sport closely, it seems they're the only ones aware of either Jermall Charlo or Demetrius Andrade. This was a fight that DAZN,
they were willing to pay for it. They were willing to bankroll it years ago, but Jermall Charlo,
neither he or his team were receptive to that deal. Crossing over to Matchroom, crossing over to DAZN for a one-fight deal, just a one-fight engagement worth something like $6-7 million. Demetrius was a champion back then. He's not a champion anymore.
It was a unification match before. It's not that now.
I think they made those offers to do that fight in, 2018, 2019? In the subsequent years that followed, has anything happened that would make a fight between Demetrius and Jermall bigger?
Oh, the last 2 years, Jermall hasn't even fought.
Demetrius, I'm sorry to say, he hasn't done himself any favors. He was ordered to fight his mandatory Yenny Beckham Kanalai. He didn't want to do that. He said he was going to move up in weight, take on Zach Parker, vie for WBO interim status. He didn't do that either.
The first time the fight collapsed, they said it was because he was injured. The second time the fight collapsed, it's because he didn't like the money.
The first time out, he stood to make approximately over $1 million, but the second time out, after he recuperated from the injury, the purse got cut down to something like $300,000. He didn't want to do that, though I asked myself, what did he get paid to fight Desmond Nicholson?
The same or less, I think.
You're supposed to headline opposite the ring Zach Parker in what was a Queensbury promotion show in the United Kingdom. He was supposed to headline. He elected not to do that, decided to fight on an undercard instead, Gervonta Davis's undercard for the Hector Luis Garcia fight against Desmond Nicholson.
Right.
A journeyman. I hardly think they broke the bank to pay Demetrius.
To fight a journeyman on an undercard. but
What was supposed to have heralded Demetrius Andrade's new relationship with the PBC on the premise that it would bring him closer to fights like the Charlo fight or the Benavidez fight.
both of which have yet to materialize.
Here today, it's hard to say that a fight between Demetrius and Jamal holds the same appeal that it once did when they were both middleweight champions, unbeaten middleweight champions. Demetrius is not a middleweight champion anymore. You have to question if they mean to do this fight, where does it take place? Does it take place at middleweight for Jamal's WBC title, or would it take place at super middleweight?
Since Jamal has a mandatory challenger in the queue, Carlos Adames, why should Demetrius get to skip him?
That if they wanted to do this fight at middleweight, would the WBC allow it? Charlo says that he's willing to go straight into the Andrade fight. No tune-up.
Yeah, that's what he says, but is that what he's about to do?
He hasn't had to make the middleweight limit in a very long time. 2 years, close to 2 years.
He hasn't fought in a very long time, so he's gonna fight this guy straight away.
Hard to imagine. It's likelier than not that Jamal Charlo fights in a tune-up fight first, and if he does fight in a tune-up fight,
You're gonna leave Carlos in limbo to go fight Demetrius.
that does require some consideration, some reconciliation, because Carlos is the WBC's interim champion. Demetrius isn't.
I don't understand why Jamal Charlo don't get stripped of that title, or at minimum, I don't know why he don't just leave the middleweight division. You're not doing anything there.
Say he's got back problems, he's got personal problems, but when you have that many problems that impede your ability to do your job and fulfill your obligations as a champion, then you shouldn't be a champion.
They should label him a champion in recess, and if he really wants to be a champion that bad, he'll pick up where he left off when he comes back.
Whatever that is, when it comes to Demetrius, it would be another example of Demetrius Andrade shooting himself in the foot if he doesn't end up fighting Charlo and he doesn't end up fighting David Benavidez. The whole point of going over there was to bring himself closer to decent-sized fights and big fights. If none of that happens...
You swerved Yanni back for nothing. You swerved Zach Parker for nothing.
If none of that happens, if a Charlo fight don't materialize or a David Benavidez fight don't materialize, that would then mean that you swerved Yanni Beck for no reason, no good reason, and you swerved Zach Parker so you could fight Desmond Nicholson.
A journeyman in Desmond Nicholson, because that's the only thing that came out of it.
The only thing that came out of Demetrius Andrade swerving those fights is he got to fight a journeyman on an undercard. You could have headlined opposite the ring Yanni Beck as a defending champion. You could have headlined opposite the ring Zach Parker. You instead elected to fight on an undercard.
The ends have to justify the means.
The whole point was getting a fight with either Jamal Charlo or David Benavidez. And if none of that happens...
Another example of Demetrius shooting himself in the foot.
We're going to trust Jamal Charlo to go straight into a Demetrius Andrade fight after 2 years of inactivity with no tune-up.
What about David Benavidez?
Could end up fighting Demetrius, or he could end up fighting David Morrell. There's no guarantees.
See what happens.